Now look guys, I love Rivian. I love the product, I love the brand as a whole, what they stand for, and I think RJ is a terrific leader. I'm really impressed by all the things they've achieved. However, it goes without saying, they just had a pretty rough earnings report. And the stock, at least at the time of recording this video, is pretty much at an all-time low. They announced 10% of their salaried workforce is going to be laid off. My apologies to everybody who's about to get their termination notice. And Rivian confirmed kind of what we all knew was coming from the standard range options and all the leasing options appearing, which is that there's a slowdown in electric vehicle demand. And there's a lot of people that are now skeptical of whether or not Rivian has a future, which I think affects kind of the entire EV industry, because we've seen the success story that was Tesla, you know, burning money for several years, but once they hit volume production, they were able to bring in some profits, and now there's very little debate on whether or not Tesla can exist. It's just a question of how big will Tesla be? Are they going to be the robotaxi, AI, and bot company, or are they just going to be a very cool energy company? But no one's really advocating that Tesla's going to die anymore, and many share the belief that, well, Tesla only can succeed because of Elon, and no one else is going to be able to do what Elon was able to do. So many think that if Rivian can't make it, how could any EV startup make it? Because they had so much cash on hand, a tremendous stockpile from their IPO, from investments from Amazon, and they just convinced a lot of fairly big whale investors that they were worth investing in. And of course, now those investors are probably quite sad, but they convinced a lot of people to give them a lot of cash. And basically the analogy I keep coming back to for looking at all of these EV startup companies, and it kind of applies to any startup company in general, is that running these EV startups is kind of like trying to fly a plane that's dropped out of the sky. You pick up a lot of speed as you're plummeting towards the earth, and the altitude of your plane could kind of be looked at as like your cash on hand. Rivian had a ton of cash on hand, so they're starting very high, and they've got all these different products like the R1T and the R1S and the delivery van, and those are all kind of your engines. They're meant to propel you. They're meant to keep you in the air, but when you first start them up, you're kind of nosediving with an EV startup. You're plummeting towards the earth, and they're quickly running out of cash or running out of altitude, and Rivian is banking and hoping on the idea that with this R2 unveil in a couple of weeks, it's going to bring in enough cash or bring in enough altitude, give them an additional engine to pull up before they hit the ground and go bankrupt, and be able to fly and catch up with the other aircraft like the Teslas or the Fords of the automotive industry. And it's a very dangerous maneuver for a company to go through, because in order to build up the R2 line, there's going to be a lot of additional expense. There's going to be a lot of funding and a lot of cash they're going to have to burn through before they see any return on that investment. And that's why a lot of people were quite nervous for Rivian, because they're losing money on every vehicle sold. And the good news is that we got from the earnings report is there's going to be a factory shutdown about halfway through the year that will affect their guidance. They said they didn't expect deliveries to grow this year, kind of like Tesla. They said we're probably going to deliver the same number of cars that we delivered last year. Also, not a great look for a company everybody's kind of pricing in a lot of future growth for. But with that factory shutdown, which will be painful and likely result in a big dip in revenue, they said by the fourth quarter of this year, they expect to achieve a gross profit on the vehicles sold. Keep in mind that is not net profit. It just means that they'll actually be bringing in money from the vehicles they sell. It does not mean that the company as a whole will become profitable. That's going to take longer. But with their dwindling cash pile, a lot of people are wondering, well, Rivian told us the R2 is not going to be ready until 2026. So if the company is still losing money, okay, not as quickly as they are now, but if you're still losing money all throughout 2024 and all throughout 2025, is Rivian going to have enough of a cash pile to get the R2 out there, build the R2 profitably, and ship it worldwide to the point that they can actually get a net profit and not just a gross profit? That's kind of the big question here, and they're not going to be able to pull much from their shareholders if more and more people keep selling on the stock. It's one of the quickest EV stock movements I've ever seen. Within a single day, the company losing like 30% of its value. Yeah, that's rough, and that's part of the reason, despite my love of Rivian as a company, as much as I love driving them and checking out the products, and I still point them out to my wife all the time every time I see one, which is pretty regularly now, I'm not a shareholder, and there's a reason for that. You know, I tend to love others and enjoy experiences with my heart, but when it comes to investing, I try to do it more with my brain than I do my heart. And there's definitely a part of my heart that wants to invest in Rivian just because I love the the brand so much and I love the company and I want to be on board this train, but my mind was the one telling me this whole dangerous maneuver of nosediving towards the earth, hoping that you can pull up at the last second and turn a profit and not go bankrupt, is very dangerous. And because the R2 platform is going to require a lot of capital to get up and running, and they haven't even really started a lot of the big expenses for that yet, that's what I had in the back of my mind every time people were buying Rivian stock or telling me that, oh, maybe the shares are worth buying now, or, you know, it's lower than it's ever been, so maybe we should consider jumping in. I kept thinking, this is not the hardest stage Rivian is in. As bad as it looks right now, their cash pile is going to get much, much lower, and their spending, especially as you're revving up production of the R2 line, is probably going to get much, much higher. So what I'm trying to say is Rivian is going to be much closer to the brink of bankruptcy right around the time that R2 vehicle deliveries begin, and that's where I expect the company to be, like, on life support. Everyone, including Elon, is probably going to be pointing and laughing, saying, see, how can they sustain this? How can they keep the company afloat? They're going to die any second now. And that's going to be a real turning point for the company, and that's part of the reason I'm so interested and going to be monitoring the R2 unveil so closely, because this vehicle really needs to save the company. A lot of people were disagreeing with Rivian, saying, why are they shutting down the R1 line and trying to achieve a gross profit with those vehicles when the R2 is really where the money is at the end of the day? But I think the R2 is gonna be a big pain in the butt to mass produce, and they're probably gonna lose money on it well into its first year of production. And keep in mind, the R2, while Rivian says it's coming in 2026, that probably doesn't mean January. In the meantime, I actually think it's wise for Rivian to not focus too much on growth, especially if every vehicle you sell, you're losing more money on. That's kind of a good reason to not keep building vehicles and not necessarily grow your production, even though that may look good on paper, and a lot of people like the street credibility of, hey, they grew their deliveries, they're building more than ever before, yeah, they're winning, they're out there, the trucks are on the road, people are enjoying them, and as long as the product is good, then the company will work out. No, not necessarily true. That could be a really sad reality to accept here for Rivian. You might actually sell yourself out of business if you keep losing money on every vehicle sold. So that's why, as hard as it is to hear about layoffs and as hard as it is to hear about factory shutdowns, I think it's actually really important that Rivian figure out how to reduce their cash burn and how to achieve some form of profit. Let's start with gross profit on the R1 vehicles so that they can keep themselves afloat during that initial R2 ramp up phase, which is not going to be easy. We know how hard it was for Tesla with the Model 3 program, and that was a fairly efficient vehicle. That required, 50 to 70 kilowatt hour battery packs on fairly basic sedans, whereas Rivian is trying to make these off-roading adventure vehicles that are probably still going to require 80 to 100 kilowatt hour battery packs, and I'm honestly more in favor of them going with lower range options. They've teased us with the R2 platform that it'll be a coil suspension that's definitely smaller. Efficiency is desperately, I think, what Rivian needs with the R2 vehicle, and I'll be looking at how complicated the interior design is. I'm hoping at the unveil they kind of dive into how they expect to manufacture the R2 for substantially less than the R1, and simultaneously, how do you make the R2 vehicle desirable, but not too desirable to the point that nobody wants to buy your R1 vehicles, because they confirmed it on this week's earnings. R1 demand is kind of shrinking a little bit. I don't think it's necessarily just Rivian's fault. It's an industry-wide problem. Tesla's experiencing demand slumps too. Interest rates are still pretty high, and I think if there is a startup in the EV space that's going to make it, it is Rivian. They have the cash pile. Lucid is just being artificially inflated by the Saudis. It's practically a privately run company at this point. But the impressive metric that I just want to hold on to and point more towards whenever people are skeptical of Rivian or claiming that they need to make vehicles more like Tesla or something is Rivian has the #1 best-selling EV in the country above $70,000. Okay, and this is a brand new company that just started delivering vehicles a couple of years ago, and they already have one of the best EV sales for a $70,000 vehicle. And that's no easy feat. There are a ton of EVs that cost over $70,000, and I think it's saying something that Rivian is the #1 seller in that category. So if people do spend more than $70,000 on their car, a Rivian, like an R1T or an R1S, is kind of what people are expecting to get out of it in terms of functionality. And I think a lot of that comes down to the R1 vehicles being so cool and so fun and so capable, but a lot of it also comes down to the brand. A lot of people buy vehicles emotionally, not necessarily logically. It's not always about the specs or the 0 to 60 times. Sometimes it just comes down to this product, this vehicle vehicle is a reflection of myself. I'm gonna be getting out of this car everywhere I go, and I'm gonna be showing up to work or at social events with this thing, so I want it to represent me well, and that Rivian brand represents a lot of people out there very comfortably, and that's enough of a reason for a ton of people to not buy a Tesla or not buy a Ford or a Toyota just because they don't like what the brand is associated with or what the brand stands for. And I think that's something Tesla underestimates, the effectiveness of brand power and what you stand for with your vehicle design, and that's something Rivian's really getting right, and I'm just hoping that these shutdowns and these gross profits they hit later in the year are able to keep them afloat, because this cash pile's not going to go forever. If you're asking me personally, if I had to make a guess, yes, I think they will make it through. I think Rivian has a lot of valuable intellectual property, and even if they do run out of cash, they're going to have a lot of assets with a factory line building vehicles that there's demand for, that are gross profit, and the R2 vehicle launch, which we're going to see here in a couple weeks, I think is going to generate a lot of hype and probably bring a lot of big investors back on board and say, okay, this company does have a future, it has an audience, and we just need to burn through a lot of cash before we actually start seeing a return on investment. But even with the stock at its all-time lows, this is not investment advice, do your own research, I'm still not buying. I think personally that we haven't seen the lowest it's going to get. We'll see if I end up being wrong in the long term, but I really want Rivian to make it above all. I don't care what they got to do to get there, whether that involves factory shutdowns or streamlining their production line and taking out a lot of the complexities with the engineering. Come on, RJ, do what you got to do, but bring us home. Don't give up. I know it's hard, but it's going to be worth it in the end, because you really do have a passionate community about your vehicles like no other. Thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. It seriously helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos. So thanks again. Have an excellent rest of your day.